Chapter 2 of Building a Railroad by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2. Blind Nellie. Although Don and Gil Winthrop were twins, and of course of the same age, Don took the lead in everything without hesitation, and his brother instinctively accorded him first place and was content to follow at his dictation. Gil was more like his mother, who was of a gentle, yielding disposition, while Don seemed to be the counterpart of his father, who had been a man of action, perseverance, and uncommon energy. The boys had never had a quarrel in their lives, and the possibility of a serious disagreement between them seemed very remote indeed. So when the railroad contract was fairly started, Don took the entire supervision of the job on his shoulders, and Gil was satisfied to pass the larger portion of his time in the neighborhood of the big steam shovel, which had begun to eat its way into that particular spur of foothills which stood in the path of the projected roadbed. A temporary track had been laid down for something like a mile and a half to the outskirts of Lakeview for the purpose of hauling the earth from the hills to a 10-acre plot of low, swampy ground. This piece of land the Winthrop brothers had purchased cheap, and proposed to reclaim it by raising it to a level with the grade. This was a bit of speculation on Don's part, for he knew that the owners of the Greenville Carriage Works, now located in the small town of Greenville, 30 miles distant, were looking for a convenient building site close to the new railway line, and he had made overtures to them on the subject, with every prospect of completing the deal in time. Later on, Don proposed to fill in a certain part of the lake shore within half a mile of the cut, which he and his brother had also acquired by purchase. On this made land they proposed to build a summer hotel, with tennis ground, bathing pavilion, and other modern improvements. It was a warm spring day, and everything was progressing favorably with the grading work of the new railroad line. Don had 3 gangs at work. At the cut there were 5 Italian laborers under Joe Sinke, the foreman. This gang was employed in shifting the steam shovel when necessary, taking up and relaying the tracks for the cars, shifting loaded and unloaded cars, etc. Besides these men, there was the engineer of the stationary engine, the fireman, and the cranesman. The wages and other expenses of the outfit was about $150 per week. Besides, there were engineers of the 2 locomotives and dumping gang at the other end of the track. The 3rd gang, which was largest, was working between the cut and the Lakeview terminal, along fairly level ground. Don was here, there, and everywhere when work was in progress. After dinner on this particular day he was out at the cut giving sundry instructions to his brother, who for the present was anchored at that facility. Then, feeling that he had a respite for a while, he strolled over the foothills toward the cliff abutting on the lake. This cliff had to be tunneled at a certain point for the tracks to pass through. This was the most delicate and difficult part of the contract, but it was a piece of work that appealed to Don's engineering tastes. He was really very enthusiastic over the prospect of successfully piercing that wall of rock. When Don reached the cliff, he seated himself on a boulder in a nook along the rocks and began to study the face of the projection which was to be penetrated by the drills. He wondered how much labor and how many pounds of dynamite would be required to do the work within the lines of excavation as indicated by the plans. "It'll be a nice piece of work," he mused as his eyes roved up and down the bare cliff. "Drilling and blasting must be conducted with all possible care to prevent shattering of the roof and sides beyond the section lines." Undoubtedly this was the most fascinating part of the contract for Don. 50 feet above where he sat, the cliff projected in half-arch fashion over the surface of the lake. Up there it was covered by a struggling mass of early vegetation, which shone brightly green in the afternoon sunlight. A rough, irregular pathway pursued its sinuous course from the shoreline to the top of the cliff. 100 feet from the edge of that airy height, Don could just make out the roof of Jim Kelso's humble cottage. The only sign of life in that vicinity was the wisp of hazy-looking smoke, which floated straight up in the air from the red brick chimney at the back of the house. But as Don looked upward, a sunbonnet came into view, and then by degrees the figure of a young girl in a check gown approached the edge of the cliff, standing there in the full glory of sunshine. "Good gracious!" gasped Don. "That's little blind Nellie. A step or 2 more and she'll plunge to certain death among the rocks down there. How can I warn her?" And the boy stood up in great excitement, but his anxious solicitude for the girl was really thrown away. Nellie knew exactly where she was, although to her eyes the world was a blank. Her senses of touch and hearing were marvelous. She knew every foot of the ground and of the exact contour of the landscape for miles around the Kelso cottage. The boy understood something about Nellie's remarkable perceptive faculties, but for all that, he was startled by her apparent peril. "Nellie!" he shouted eagerly. "Go back! You're on the very edge of the cliff." The girl easily heard and recognized the voice as it was wafted up to her. She looked down at him and smiled as though she really saw him. "What are you doing down there, Winthrop?" she asked, taking off her bonnet and swinging it lazily to and fro by one of its strings. "I'm coming up to talk to you in a moment," he said, suiting the action to the word, for it made him nervous to see her standing in so dangerous a spot. "No, please don't," she replied in a tone that brought him to a full pause at once. "And why not?" asked Don impetuously, for since the day, 3 months before, when he had thrashed Jerry Kelso for striking her in the face, a cowardly act that made his blood boil at the time, he had often thought of the blind girl. Her unfortunate condition as the drudge of the Kelsos appealed to his chivalry, and he had looked forward to another meeting with her as a matter of great pleasure. The girl turned toward the cottage before answering. Then she said, "I'll come down." With the fearlessness of one sure of her way, Nellie walked a dozen yards back along the edge of the cliff until she came to the beginning of a roughly hewn pathway, which she seemed to recognize without difficulty, and then started to descend the face of the rock. No one watching her movements, which were as light and graceful as a fawn, would for a single moment have supposed her to be blind. Don, too impatient to await her coming, sprang forward to meet her, and the girl knew he was coming up from the moment he took the first step. "Donald Winthrop, what an impetuous boy you are!" she exclaimed with a winsome smile that lighted up as lovely a countenance as any painter could wish to transfer to canvas. A sudden draught of air whistling about the cliff caught and blew out the unconfined tresses of her beautiful hair, and the sunlight transformed it into a mass of living, burnished gold. "Impetuous, am I?" laughed Don as he continued to advance to meet her. "To tell the truth, it gives me a chill to see you coming down the path in such a reckless manner." "Why, there isn't any danger," replied the girl in a tone of surprise. "Isn't there? Well, I don't know about that. How can you know but the heavy rain yesterday morning may have loosened a rock here and there? But I'm always very careful where I trust my feet, Don Winthrop," she said. "I should judge by your movements that you are not half as careful as you ought to be." "That's because you don't know me," she answered with a smile as she placed her hand in his confidingly when she felt he was near to her. "You are a truly wonderful girl, Nellie," said Don with a sympathetic, almost tender look down into her sightless eyes. "Surely you've not always been blind?" "No," she replied sadly. "I had a fall which injured the optic nerve, so that I gradually lost my sight a few years ago." She suffered him to seat her on the boulder which he had just vacated, and she sat there in silence for a moment or two, with her face turned toward the lake, while he sat by her side and studied the beautiful face in its frame of golden hair. "If Mother Kelso or Jerry should chance to see us together, I'm afraid there would be trouble," she said at length. "Are you sure we are alone?" "Yes, Nellie, quite alone," replied the boy after a rapid glance around the lonesome spot. "I'm glad," she continued in an eager voice. "I wanted so much to see you, Donald Winthrop. You are building a railroad near here, are you not? You and your brother?" "Yes, Nellie." "And that is why you came here, I suppose, to look around?" "Yes. We're going to blast a tunnel through the base of that cliff by and by, and I came over to study the looks of the place. Mr. Andrew Newman, that's the man Mr. Kelso works for, wanted to build this road, didn't he?" "Yes," answered Don, rather surprised at her remark. "I heard Mr. Kelso talking about it at the cottage. Mr. Newman is very angry because you got the contract, and—" She grasped Don's hand while a little shudder agitated her. "I'm afraid you will have trouble over the work. Mr. Kelso frightened me with the threats he used against you particularly." "Why me in particular?" "Because," and the boy saw the tears start in her beautiful eyes, "he hates you bitterly. He says he means to get square with you for taking my part that day Jerry struck me, and I have never had the chance to thank you sufficiently for your courage in coming to my assistance." But now I am sorry you did, so sorry, because Mr. Kelso is a harsh and unreasonable man, and I dread lest he should do you an injury, and all on my account." "Nonsense, Nellie. I can take care of myself. I don't fear Jim Kelso a little bit. And if I hear of Jerry Kelso abusing you again, I'll give him another dressing down, one that he won't soon forget." No, you mustn't," she said earnestly. "You don't know these people. They're very vindictive." "I shall keep a bright lookout against any of their little tricks," answered Don resolutely. "I hope you will," she said with evident anxiety, "for I am sure they mean you harm, Donald Winthrop. I heard Mr. Kelso say that you had a gang of men excavating the hill yonder." And Nellie waved her hand in the direction of the cut. "He told Mother Kelso he meant to do something in that direction that would knock your operations out for a while. You have an Italian there named Mike Rossi. You ought to watch him, for I am sure he is a very bad man. He used to work for Mr. Kelso. He was sent over to your place to get employment, and for no good purpose." "I'm much obliged to you, Nellie, for this warning," said Don gratefully, "and I'm looking for trouble from the Newman people. But of course I cannot tell in what shape it is likely to come. I shall have this Rossi spotted, and if we catch him up to any funny business, I'll have him in jail so quick that it'll make his head swim." "I'm so glad of this chance to tell you these things," said the blind girl, looking up in Don's face. "I should feel very miserable if any harm happened to you." "And I'm very grateful to you for interesting yourself in my behalf," replied the handsome young contractor. "I wish I could do something for you in return. I can't understand why a girl of your gentle nature is willing to put up with the life you lead with the Kelsos. You ought to leave them. My mother would be glad to offer you a home while I—" No, replied the girl with a frightened look. "I dare not leave them." "Dare not?" exclaimed Don impetuously. "Why?" The girl looked at him appealingly. "Tell me," urged the boy earnestly, "has this Jim Kelso any claim on you?" "You must not ask me. Indeed, you must not," she cried with a look of fear. "Are you a relative of his?" "No," she answered reluctantly. "Then what possible hold can he have on you?" Nellie only bent her head, and Don could see the tears stealing down her cheeks. The sympathy he had all along felt for this gentle creature came to the surface with great warmth. He bent over her and seized her little hands. "There's some mystery in this, little girl. Why will you not trust me? I will be your friend. Tell me what the trouble is. Nellie, I insist on knowing." Nellie sprang up with a suppressed scream and clung to Don's arm. The boy turned quickly about to find Jim Kelso standing within a few feet of them, regarding him with a look as black as thundergust. End of chapter 2.